and welcome to General Services Public Works Committee. With me today are Council Members Wood and English, and it is September 12th at noon, and we are here in the library community room. Today we have one item on our agenda, and that's to provide feedback on possible amendments to the short-term rental ordinance. And with us today we have our Community Planning Director, Hillary Anderson, and our Municipal Services Director, Renata McLeod. Welcome, Renata.
Good afternoon. I'm here to kick it off. We have several people to talk to today, so we'll kind of switch up the speakers for you a little bit. I just wanted to start out with a little bit of history to remind everybody that state code was amended in 2017. It clearly states that cities cannot prohibit short-term rentals, but it does set up some ability to do some guidelines on short-term rentals. The city produced a short-term rental ordinance in 2017, and since that time, there's been some complaints brought forward. There's been some housing analysis, and noting that it may affect some of the availability of housing to our local citizens. So at this point, I just wanted to remind everybody what the statute actually says. So while it says we cannot prohibit short-term rentals, it does say that a county or a city may implement such reasonable regulations as it deems necessary to safeguard the public health, safety, and general welfare in order to protect the integrity of residential neighborhoods. So as we speak today, there's maybe a lot of ways to meet the intent of that code. So we're just going to outline a few that we've been discussing internally and with the other subcommittee. So we'll be hearing a little bit of feedback from that subcommittee. We're here to just seek some information back from council. This is the beginning of the conversation. You'll hear from Hillary later on kind of what our timeline is, and that there'll be opportunities for public input and public comment as we move forward with this project. We do have an annual permit that's issued, so it really only provides for that short-term rental license for a one-year period of time. So there's no guaranteed of continuance of that license. It is solely for that 12-month period of time, and that will be renewed in March. So we're hoping to have some stuff tidied up and presented back to you and approved before that March renewal date. And with that, I will turn it over to Sean from our planning department.
Thank you, Renata. So much like last time, I'll cover the same elements that we did last month. So in 2015 to 2017, the city of Coeur d'Alene had recognized that we didn't have a short-term rental ordinance at that time. And so the use was illegal, and staff was asked to take a look at that and come up with an ordinance. In the meantime, while we were working on that, the state decided to pass their own requirements for short-term rentals, and they kind of aligned. And so we had to make light touch changes to that, but in the meantime, we were also asked to have a light touch ordinance and that we'd revisit this, this topic in the future. Well, we were back to provide the information that we have found, and that's where we're at right now. Since the last meeting, we have received a number of emails for and against, and we're holding on to those until public comment will be taken in the future, and then we'll provide all of those emails to everybody so that they don't come, here and there and get lost in the mix. They'll be provided all at once. So right now, as of last month, there were 381 permitted vacation rentals in the city of Coeur d'Alene, and these two maps show where those are located inside of city limits, as well as a zoomed in area south of I-90 that show where the concentration of those are. Of those 381, 184 of those have a homeowner's exemption. So, taking it back 1 year ago, as of last month, this is where the city was at that time. There was 228 legally permitted short-term rentals a year ago, and that represents approximately a 40% growth rate year over year, which is a pretty big growth rate. And the city has received information from host compliance companies that come forward and say, hey, here's what's happening inside of your city, because the city doesn't have the software or the employee power to go and search down 16 different platforms. They change quite often and how they operate. So they've been trying to get a contract with the city and provide us little nuggets of information, hoping to entice us to hire them in the future. So at that time, they did a scraping of all of those websites and said that we had approximately 645 operating, which was about 417 of those which were operating without permits, which represents about 65%. So that means that there's 2.83 short-term rentals operating without a permit for every one that was legal. So some of the things that we've heard from the neighborhoods is that there's too many that are concentrated together because of the map that I showed here, that as you get closer to the lake, you can demand more per night. People want to be close to downtown and those sorts of amenities. Absentee ownership was another thing that we had heard of, is that that the house may have some shortcomings or issues with it, such as garbage or the sprinklers are going off at weird times. Other ones are operations, noise, pets, parking, that sort of thing. Hillary will talk in greater detail about that in a few minutes on what the pick list items are. So extrapolating from a year ago to today, like I had mentioned earlier, there's a 381. And so if we take that same information and say, okay, well, the number that we're operating without permits, and you just bring that forward a year, our best guess right now is that there's a little over 1,000 of them, or 697, that are operating without permits at this time. So staff is asking for input from council and planning commission, whether or not the timing is correct to hire one of the companies that can monitor the marketplace in this area. That cost would be borne by the applicants or the ones that are operating legally. It wouldn't come from the taxpayer. It would be self-funded from the people that own these things and are operating legally. So with that, unless there's any questions of me, I will turn it over to Hillary to talk more about the pick list. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Sean. So given some of that background context you heard from Renata and Sean, staff was asked to look at our ordinance and addressing some of those issues that we have heard, and also kind of just the context of having so many that are in non-compliance and what that does to neighborhoods. And so what we did is, in your packet, there is a pick list, and so I'm sure you've seen that along with the staff report and then the draft code language. The pick list is really kind of helpful tool for looking at what the current code is now, and then options for a variety of these issues on the screen. And so how we organized that is that in blue represents what's in our current code, and then there's some other options. And so this list is derived from researching this actually from the very beginning when we looked at developing the first code for the city, and then looking at ordinances for communities in Idaho and throughout the U.S. on how they've addressed some of these issues. And so looking at duration of stay, and should there be more of a minimum, 2-night minimum was something that's been proposed as helping kind of reduce some of the impacts. Parking, should there be some off-site parking required? Right now it's encouraged, if there's additional off-street parking, that would be where they would need to park before they park on the street, but we don't have any requirement about that. The ownership is where we get in.
Do you want to wait to the end for questions?
Yeah, I think right now,
Okay.
if so, what I was thinking of doing is kind of just going through the pick list, and then we'll get into kind of the other things. It might help just to kind of for flowing. Owner occupancy was something that's in the current draft code for discussion. So kind of going through that, if that's something that council would support for limiting that. There's other ways to do that as well. Talk through that. The types of units allowed, kind of clarifying what is an allowable unit, and then also what's not allowed. The zoning, so this was kind of a big thing too, is, looking at in terms of the residential areas versus the commercially zoned properties, and then those that have kind of the infill overlay districts. Location and quantity, so this is something a lot of communities do as well, is to have maybe a total cap on that, and then also limiting within kind of proximity, maybe a lottery system or something for how those should be spaced, and the overall number that's appropriate. Occupancy, currently we use the definition of family, which is how we apply it because it's in a residential area, it's in a home, and so that's one way, but a lot of communities actually have it based on what's a bedroom and define the bedroom and number of people that are allowed for that, so those are ways to look at it. The accessory dwelling units, so that kind of goes back to that owner occupied. If you have an accessory dwelling unit, you can have one of those, could be a short-term rental and one could be occupied by the homeowner or one of their relatives for 6 months and a day out of the year. The fees is kind of a big thing, the permit fee as well as the enforcement fee. So wanted to get council's take on those items. So as we have drafted it now, we're calling it a draft ordinance, but it's really just a starting point. As Renata mentioned, it's just to kind of frame up something for you to look at. Really want to dialogue with the council, and then, as Sean mentioned, we've been getting a lot of feedback from community members on both sides, and so it's important to kind of consider all the angles of this. But we put it in that format just so it's easier for you to see what it would look like and to kind of help understand this, at least the initial look at what we're considering, going from that light touch to something that's a little bit stronger in terms of how it could be regulated to reduce some of the impacts, the negative impacts on our neighborhoods. So as drafted, again, it's looking at the owner occupied for the residential zones and then the mobile home 8, so MH8. And so that would either be someone would have to live on the property, so they could rent out a room, or they could rent out the main home and live in the accessory dwelling unit, or vice versa. And then the commercially zoned properties, they would be allowed to have one per owner per property. So if it's an apartment building with commercial zoning, just one of those could be a short-term rental versus allowing the whole complex to turn into kind of a hotel use. So that's how that is drafted. The minimum 2-night stay has been proposed as a way to help reduce impacts on neighborhoods. So right now we don't have any limit. So if you just have one night, you have quick turnovers, it's a lot of impact on the neighborhood, but also on the homes themselves. And so that's one way to help reduce that neighborhood impact. And then a proposal to remove the 14-day exemption. So we initially called that kind of the Ironman exemption. And so letting people rent out their home without a permit during either Ironman or some other time of the year for 14 days consecutively. But we've learned that that has led to a lot of potential challenges for neighborhoods. Some of those people that are doing that might do it more than 14 days, and it's really not something that can be monitored and tracked very well. So that's one of the things that's been proposed and is written into this draft code for review, and then increasing the violation fees. Right now, we have the $100 violation fee, and that, we actually haven't issued a whole lot of violations. There's some complaints, but this is something where we've heard from some of your counterparts that really need to do more with the violation and getting these STR owners into compliance. So as drafted in the ordinance, the first offense would be a civil offense, and then subsequent would be $3,000 and a misdemeanor citation, is how that is currently drafted for your review. So we really wanted to hear from you on kind of some of the issues here, and then happy to answer any of your questions as well. We did hear from the other 3 council members at the August 22nd meeting. I'll kind of recap what they said as well. So they supported the issues on the screen that we'll kind of go through. They wanted us to do a little bit more research with those compliance companies and find out what services they can offer and what data they have available. They liked the idea of capping the number of short-term rentals south of Harrison Avenue in particular, because you can see on the map the concentration of them. They would like to consider bringing some of the properties into compliance if they get a short-term rental permit. So one idea was, should they now have to have paved off-street parking? So things like that. And then also, they did support the idea of hiring a short-term rental compliance company to help staff. I mean, right now, as you all know, we don't have the staffing and the capacity. The police department does some of the code enforcement, working with municipal services, with planning. We're all working together trying to, and legal, of course, to track this and manage it, but it's really gonna take more than that. It would take full-time staff assistants, I think, or working with a short-term rental company, and we can roll those fees in on the permit, so then it's really not being passed on to the tax, their community members through our property taxes and things like that. So that was kind of the gist of theirs. Again, they did support what was in here, but want to hear from you today on, do you like some of these ideas that we've presented? Would you like us to research other ideas? What should we be exploring as we move forward and bring this to the joint workshop with City Council and Planning Commission for further discussion? And so the items in particular wanted to kind of have you look at are the pick list items that are in there and what we've proposed, or if there's other things on the list. Again, enforcement and fines, compliance, company support, and then the permit fees. But really, the gist of this is having a big impact on our neighborhoods. And if you can see on some of the maps that Sean showed before, there are some areas where there are 5 on a block. And that is excessive. Let me pull up that one map if I can, just so you can kind of have a sense of what this looks like in the area south of Harrison. So the little red guys are the homes indicate short-term rental permits. The blue is homeowners exemptions and the red is non-homeowners exemptions. And so kind of just looking at.
Hillary, will you say that again, between the two
Yeah.
reds?
Between the two reds, yeah, let me turn off, it might be easier if I turn off the one layer. The red, the darker red is non-homeowners exemption, so somebody that owns it as a secondary or, additional property that's not their main residence. So the blue are ones that have homeowners exemptions, so. Yeah, we'll work on having the map color change, so it's a little easier to see the red and the blue. So, and then this one's without, so you can just see the number of short-term rental. And these, again, are the permitted ones, so if we have 70+% operating in the city that don't even have permits, we have a much greater impact than is indicated on the screen here. So I guess I'll mention kind of what's up next, and then we'll go back to kind of the pick list and some of the other issues and questions for you. But so the goal was to really reach out to the council members through these 2 subcommittees and get your input and allow for the public to hear the discussion, being really transparent with the process. Stakeholder outreach, reaching out to all of the permit holders. We'll be doing that following these meetings, make sure they're all aware of this. I think they're in the know. We've heard from a lot of them, and there's groups been formed, but also some of the neighborhood groups. A lot of them are having concerns about the number of short-term rentals in the city and the impacts. We will be collecting all of the letters and emails. We'll be summarizing those and then sharing the full packet of those with council and the Planning Commission prior to a joint workshop that we're looking to schedule. And at the joint workshop, we will be having the public comment portion of that as well, so that they have an opportunity at that point to speak. And then that'll be great for council and Planning Commission to hear from them. And then we'll follow up with public hearings on any draft ordinance. So again, we anticipate the ordinance will be modified as we go through this process, but really wanted to hear from you today on those key issues and anything else that you would like some clarification from staff on.
Well, thank you, Hillary. And I'd like to open it up to my fellow council members just to have discussion. We don't have an action item, so to speak, other than to give some feedback so we can have a open flowing conversation today.
Great, thank you. Dan, you wanted to go a minute ago.
Well, I had one question, but I'll just give overall comments to kind of begin. We have a lot of issues that come to us, and every once in a while we get one where, wow, there's a whole lot of public opinion on something, and this is one that is generating a lot of public interest and comment, and this is one of the nice times when actually we're not in some crucial timeline that whatever. I think looks like we are going to and can have a very good process where there's some definite steps, multiple points for the public to have input, and again, just to clarify, sometimes, there's been some big hoorahs over if people can speak to us at a particular meeting or not and give input, and sometimes they can and sometimes they can't, and that's defined. But there are multitudes of ways that you can give input to us all the time, and some of the letters we've already got, some we'll get more, the email. So there will, and then there's going to be the joint workshop, and I'm glad to hear that'll be one with public comment. So anyway, nothing is getting decided today at this meeting or next week, or next month. It's going to be a long-term thing. The other thing, I guess, in terms of from the council's perspective, I remember, we were part of it when we went into it, and we directed our own staff to have a light touch. And now it seems like the direction is being, we want to have a heavy hand, not a light touch. And there's, I don't know that that's an accurate description. I think we want to look at things, we want to tighten things up, but I think the council needs to be mindful. We really get irritated at the state of Idaho at times and the legislature, who does not believe in local control. In a lot of ways, they really tie our hands and do things. And I think as council, we have to be mindful that we cannot let our irritation about, what the state does or not on local control and coming in and writing a state law to prohibit us from doing a number of things before we even have really been faced with it. Although with the code that is there's still, in my mind, there's quite a bit of room to move with and everything. But anyway, just because we might have a particular attitude about legislature and pushing back on some things, that needs to not impact our decisions on, what we're doing here. And we will go through some of the different things. I'll just say, off the top, a couple of things that at first blush, when I heard, read about, owner-occupied, needs to be owner-occupied, and boy, that makes sense. As I've gotten feedback, as I've gotten, frankly, some from my own family members, and the letters, and just spending some time thinking about it, whereas I thought, that makes a good sense. Now I'm really in the other camp, I guess, is that that's when we've really got to take a hard look. And I think that if we're really going to say, owner-occupied, that has to be really justified. Also, one of the things, and one of my, is depending on what we do, there's always some options for what they call a grandfather clause, is, some things that we're able to operate under existing code up to this date in time, they're in there, and then you do some things going forward. But anyway, that's one. The one, not having one night, that's one I've got mixed feelings to. A lot of the, folks just want to come and get one for one night. I get the thing with the big bachelor party or something, but I do wonder how many of those we really have. And that could happen at somebody's house or something else. And, so that's, anyway, there are some things that, I know that there have been some public things, in the paper and from the other council meeting, and you just need to know that, council is 6 people, and when we get to something, it's going to have to be a vote of 4 for, whatever changes, and we are not of the same mind. And I would hope, at least for me, a lot of times when I go through a process like this, I've got one mind set kind of going in, and throughout the time, it gets changed a bit, and that's, I think that's a good thing. So one thing I'm absolutely in agreement is that some kind of a consulting company or somebody to do something who really knows this business, because we don't have the time to do it. I'm guessing the mechanisms that they have to do things, I mean, that's what they do for a living. So, I mean, that really makes sense. So, maybe we act as we go through. Back to the one question, or something that triggered is, I remember when I was first running, this time, for council about 7 years ago, and at that time, actually there was kind of a quaint thing that we don't hear about anymore, bed and breakfast. And I remember meeting with them and some of the same issues about, they were very concerned about, some of the bed and breakfast rule and parking, and if they had to have parking or not. So I guess that's one question. Do we still have a particular code for bed and breakfast and parking, and how does this fit in? Is it now the same thing? So
We have a code, and it requires a special use permit in the residential zones where it's allowed. And then it requires, I believe, 1 parking stall per each bedroom, and then someone has to live on site. That's either an owner or someone that's caretaker or family member.
for a bed and breakfast, and how do we define those differently than some of these other things?
I don't know if Randy knows offhand how, yeah. But it is, I think they can rent all of the rooms versus
Okay.
the short-term rental code, you can only rent 1 bedroom
Okay.
or the whole house. So it's a little bit different in
Okay.
terms of the
And is-
operation. And the
has that
meals
been-
are provided, and at least the breakfast.
Yeah. Has that been changed for a while? Will this impact any of the bed and breakfast code?
No, it's considered differently through, I think, state statutes and through our code, the bed and breakfast versus a
Yeah,
short-term rental.
our code defines or excludes bed and breakfast from short-term rental definition.
Okay. Although it seems like they're a close cousin, but, okay, well, that's my initial thought, so thanks.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hillary, there are a few things I want to add to the pick list for discussion with council. Well, this might surprise you, since I'm a retired law enforcement officer, but the enforcement part of it, I'm not in favor of a misdemeanor charge. A misdemeanor is fairly serious, and it can stay on someone's record for a long time, and I don't want to make criminals out of people that are renting their houses out. I am in favor of enforcement, and we do need to work on enforcement. What I'd like to see for discussion is we form a committee similar to our parking commission, where our citizens, people that are involved in short-term rentals, serve in those roles, and the cases come before them, so we're not overloading our city attorney's office with misdemeanors on short-term rentals. It doesn't mean that the fine can't be significant, but I just don't want to see a misdemeanor charge. I don't think that's appropriate. And that's just for discussion with the rest of the council. I'm not wild again about hiring an outside entity to do that. I would be more interested in having our own staff paid for through the permit fees. Again, we have time, as Dan said. We don't have to have this all resolved tomorrow, so we should look at all of those possibilities about what works best for us. I like local control a lot, and sometimes when you hire an outside entity, you don't have the kind of control that you want to have. So I'd like the citizens really involved in helping us sort through the violations. I also want on the pick list the idea that Dan's already mentioned. I too want to have further discussion about grandfathering in some of the short-term rentals. I don't know what that would look like, but what I do know is there's a lot of responsible people in the community that have short-term rentals, and I don't want, we have to find balance in everything we do. And so we really should have that conversation about grandfathering in all those permitted short-term rentals. We know that there are a lot of reasons why we're here today and why it's coming to council is the impact on the community, our public employees, our teachers, our nurses, all the core employees that we need for a city to grow and prosper can't afford to live here. And so we're dealing with the issue of maybe 1,000 unpermitted short-term rentals that are really hurting us in that regard. Also, it's not fair to all those good people that have a short-term rental that are following all the rules, are paying their permits, and are being good, responsible citizens, and it's an additional income that they need. So I think we need to separate out the two groups and really celebrate and be glad for the people that are following the rules. The possibility of a lottery system, if we are going to move forward with limiting the number, should absolutely be on the pick list. And what that would look like, and maybe some examples from other communities I'm sure you've looked at. The number, we thought, well, what's the magic number of what you will allow in a community? Right now, we have 381 permitted, is that correct?
Yep, right about.
So I'm curious if you could come back to council with like-sized community, resort town, what number worked for them? What's a good cap? You don't want it to be arbitrary, it has to have some data behind it. Let's see, what else? Oh, while we're working to resolve all of these issues, and this would take council action, I believe, I'll ask Randy this, but I really think we should move forward pretty quickly on a moratorium for new permits, because we can't have 1,000 people rushing to get a permit now, when we might not allow that many to exist. So I'd like that to maybe go on the next agenda for a discussion, Randy, if that's something we could at least do temporarily.
Yeah, we can put it on discussion. I can provide the rules for moratoriums, which generally require an emergency declaration by council.
Okay, thank you. I think I've kind of covered what I want on the pick list, but fortunately, we've gotten a little bit of public feedback. Not all that Sean has alluded to. We'll be looking forward to all those emails as well. But I do think council has to be careful to find the right balance, not be heavy-handed, but at the same time, be effective. So that's what I'm hoping comes out of this.
Thank you. And I couldn't agree with you more. This one is a delicate dance, and luckily we have time. We have time to get it right and to work with you all that are here today with us, as well as everybody who's reached out via email, phone calls to us, and to the city team as well. So I want to assure you that we're reading the emails. I have a stack of them on my office right next to my computer that I'm keeping there as we continue to move down throughout this journey. So a couple thoughts. I would love to explore a STR committee. I think that's a great idea, to have them review the violations. Possibility of combining that with parking commission, I don't know.
Yeah,
I guess that's the mayor's call for that one, but I think that's a great suggestion to look into. Hillary, can you tell me a little bit more about parking and having off-street parking available, and how that looks like in a lot of our downtown neighborhoods that just frankly do not have off-street parking available to them?
So there's a couple different ways of looking at it. The current code, it doesn't require any off-street parking unless someone was coming in and building an accessory dwelling unit, and that would trigger its own parking, right? So the ADU has to have its own parking space. But if there's an existing use that predated our ADU code when we triggered that, there is no requirement for a short-term rental permit holder to have off-street parking. We did discuss that at the time of the original ordinance. There's pros and cons to requiring the off-street parking. It definitely helps lessen up some of the impacts on the neighborhood, but it could also have that unintended consequence where someone might then convert their beautiful front yard into this big driveway. So there's kind of a balance with that. Another way to do it is also maybe just limiting the number of vehicles allowed for the short-term rentals based on if we were going to define bedrooms. So that's another thing to look at, and other communities have done that. Because a lot of these short-term rentals, people will show up, multiple families show up, they each have a vehicle, and then you're really impacting the street, and especially if you have more than one short-term rental within a block. So those are some of the impacts of the parking and then the off-street parking versus on-street.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
With that being said, I would like us to look at some options there. And I guess my concern is one size doesn't necessarily fit all for parking throughout our community. I mean, our downtown south of Harrison, parking is very different than up in the northern region. So I don't know if we want to differentiate areas with that. I'll leave that to the experts there, but just the thought behind that. How to limit or control the number is also, I don't know if there's a right answer here, but I'd like to look at options, and like Christy said, whether that's a lottery versus number of STRs in a block, number in a defined neighborhood, like Garden District or Fort Grounds, or I don't know how we would look at that, but some options there to have us toss around would be helpful. I'm interested in knowing more about the short-term rental compliance companies and their scope of work. I really like this sound, and to hear that it's cost neutral. Where I'm going with this comment is what they provide and can provide to us in their scope of work versus what we could hire, as Chrissy suggested, internally. And the budget difference with that. So do they do the tracking? Do they do the enforcement? Do they issue the permits? And do they come with recommendations? Let me see here. Sorry, my notes are a little bit all over the place. Grandfathered in, I'd like to see a proposal, what that would look like too, if we could. And then my final question for the moment is complaints. Can you give us a summary, or maybe Randy, of the top 3 complaints that we receive in regards to short-term rentals?
And Sean probably has the best sense of the complaints. He gets a lot of those, but it's tricky. Some go into the police department, some municipal services, some to planning. I think Randy's seen some of those. I guess that would be the one difference with the short-term rental compliance company, is it's all one location. We get some phone calls, we get some through, we do have an online portal that we've created, so we get some through that. We get some emails, but yeah, I know we have issues with the noise, the parking. I think those are probably the biggest issues.
And then to follow up, Sean, as you're walking, I think my next question will be, do we know if those complaints are coming from short-term rentals that are non-owner occupied?
I don't believe we make a distinction
Yeah.
between those items. I'm on the receiving end of those calls quite often when they don't go to police, and the largest ones by far are for parking, the occupancy, and then the noise, late noise. The neighbors don't appreciate it when they're out, especially if they got a hot tub that's near a window on a side yard or something like that. I hear about that quite often. The other one I get is trash. Sometimes they leave the stuff around, and I don't know what they're doing in the middle of the night to leave trash all over the place, but I do hear that complaint, but not as much as the others.
Okay, thank you. And let me just take one more look here. Oh, another question on owner occupied. In the definition of owner occupied, it says here, proposed language, it has not been adopted, shall mean real property in which, owner occupied shall mean real property in which the person who holds the title to the property or an immediate family member uses it as their primary residence for more than 6 months in a calendar year. How does that work with family member? I mean, and how do we track that? How do we enforce that?
So we have that language currently with our accessory dwelling unit code, so the ADU code. And so it's kind of on the honor system. They do the affidavit and they say that they're going to be there or a family member. With this one, I think in the latest version, we actually put in there a homeowner's exemption would be how that would be at least monitored for reviewing to see if they meet that criteria.
Okay.
You're right, it is a challenge. We don't know who's there year-round because we don't, acquire that information. But yeah, the taxation, the benefit that they get from a homeowner's exemption would show us if that is indeed owner-occupied residence. So they might live, 5 months out of the year somewhere warmer,
Right.
and then they're here
Okay.
the rest of the year.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, and it goes on to say that, just for everybody, I didn't read the full section.
Just one more quick. Hillary, I know the county has dealt with some of the, people who have 5 acres and all of a sudden 15 campers show up that are
Right.
short-term rentals. And I know that they've worked through that with their codes. How similar is the language that's being proposed to what the county is? Are there any similarities?
I haven't looked at the counties yet. I know we did have some meetings with their staff and one of the short-term rental compliance companies just to see about alignment and possibly cost savings for that service. I haven't looked at their draft code language. I don't know if Randy or Sean or Renata have. But I know in the draft ordinance before you for review, we did clarify what is an allowable use and made it very clear that it's not an RV, it's not a watercraft, so it can't be like a houseboat, it can't be a boat on a trailer in a yard, it can't be a tent, all those types of things, can't be a tree house, can't be glamping. It truly has to be a residential use that meets all the criteria of the building code.
Yeah. Okay, it'd be interesting to see. I mean, if it's not too cumbersome, we could look at just their code on short-term rentals.
Absolutely. One thing I forgot to mention too before that we would like some council input on is doing inspections as part of the permit process. So especially with the initial permit, and it could be something that's required for renewals as well, but especially with the initial one, we currently have just the self-inspection checklist, which great for those that are honest, not great for those that aren't. This is something a lot of communities do, and so it would be a staff member. So even if we work with a host compliance or one of these short-term rental compliance companies, there would still be some city staff involvement in things. The inspection would verify that what they've said on the application is true. So that could be verifying if there's bedrooms, it could be, looking at off-street parking spaces, things like that. So that's something that staff is proposing, and that could be rolled in on the permit fee as well.
I would certainly.
Somebody
like-
renting out a dirt floor bedroom or,
Yeah.
a shed in the backyard, things like that.
I would certainly like to see us explore that, so we can add that to our list. Again.
Sure. A couple of other comments. And again, we'll talk more about, if we go out to a contracting company or something, but one of the things that seems consistent is that we've got a very large data gap. I mean, there's a lot of numbers and things, facts that we really don't know, and people making suppositions about this or that. And, while having that in-house is one thing, I guess, another part of my council hat that we're dealing with budget issues, and we know we're going to have some very tough budget things, and in terms of staffings and stress on our staffings and priority for our own staff. So I guess for me, another thing, besides these folks knowing what they do, I would guess if we do something like this, like anything, there's going to be a very large initial kind of workload and projects and things, and then over time, that's part of the beauty of the contracting with somebody is you can really scale that back. And I would certainly hope and expect over time, once something is in place, the maintenance level effort is going to be different than the initial level. That's one thing. Also, and I really agree with Christie, I hadn't mentioned it, but in terms of getting into crossing the line from civil penalties and compliance into criminal is a big, big deal. So I would really be wary of that one. And then, let's see, one thing, we saw that map and how many of those dots are below the freeway and all of that. do we happen to have that number of, I don't know if it was on there, but, how many of these are above the freeway and how many are below?
Renata, did Nick do that? I don't think we've done that query. Yeah, we can do that, certainly, and we could even do it if we had neighborhood boundaries or things, if that was helpful as we study this further.
Yeah, and one of my out-of-the-box things that just hit me is, all of this, the pressure downtown, but maybe we could, I think this, some of this, we are a resort community. We want to do some of this as, gee, well, maybe we ought to have some, like some cities have free shuttle bus. I mean, get your BRB or whatever above the freeway, but we have free shuttles if they want to get
just said something
down to the
else.
lake and shopping. But that's different discussion. Okay. So.
I totally misunderstood you. I wasn't sure where you were going with that. Anything further?
No, thank you.
Hillary, have we provided enough
Yes,
direction?
I think that was very helpful. I'll have Renata come up and kind of summarize that, and then if there's any other further feedback, would gladly accept that. Thank you.
Okay, so my challenge was to listen in the audience and come up and try and summarize to you what we think you said. So here are some of the highlights we think we're walking away with. We are going to look at options regarding owner-occupied and possible grandfathering. We're going to continue to seek options for enforcement, including staff options and host-compliant agencies, so we can bring you back a lot of data of what they can do with their software to provide data points, and then maybe what staff can do regarding the enforcement aspect. So we'll continue to look at options there.
And the budget comparison between
And the
two.
budget comparison, absolutely. And then we will look at options and methods of violations to exclude misdemeanor citations. So we'll look at what we can bring forward for that. We will look at the establishment and organization of an STR committee and what their roles and responsibilities could be. We'll look at parking options that maybe have to do with geographic areas and the impacts to off-street parking throughout our city. And then look at options for establishing a cap. What would those methodologies be? What would be included in that? And then the system for limiting those numbers, be it a lottery system or some other creative system that maybe another city's already come up with. We can look at options for inspection. What staff that would be, what they would be inspecting, and the limitations on those inspections. Continue to look for ways to be effective and bring back information on a moratorium for permits. I just want to remind you again, those permits are an annual permit and they expire in March. Okay. Does that cover it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
thank you, Renata.
Thank you. Thank you all for your presentation today. Randy, Troy, anything else for us?
No.
Well, with that, this concludes our General Services Public Works meeting. I appreciate everybody in the audience coming to be with us this afternoon, and have a good week.